Are the past and the future real? Is pragmatism a valid philosophy? And what do I think about the Panpsychism of Alfred North Whitehead? These are just some of the issues we'll be wrestling with in this month's Ask Me Anything. Okay, we've got some excellent subscriber questions this month. I've just been walking home from work, mulling them over. I think this is my favourite thing I do on this channel. Really look forward to it. Anyway, before we get to that, quick update on what I've been up to in terms of public work. The footage of the event I did at the Royal Institution Theatre in London with Christian philosopher William Lane Craig, expert in Eastern religion Jessica Fraser, and atheist my God, Joe Foley. Sorry, Joe, blanked on your name just for 1 second. I just watched it. I really like how that turned out, actually. Thought what was particularly interesting is the most agreement on the panel. The most agreement on the panel seemed to come from the conservative Christian and the atheist philosopher. Didn't expect that. So they were sort of united on a lot of the discussion focused on my recent psychedelic experience on smoking toad venom, and they were both united in thinking that was a load of rubbish. No, not that's too strong. That the alleged insights into the ultimate nature of reality that I took myself to have got from this experience were a little bit unconvincing. Also, whether we need God for morality. They were both sort of bonding on that. I had to step in and say, no, we can have objective morality without God. What's wrong with being a bloody Platonist? So anyway, that was fun. And then I've recently, this hasn't gone out, at least at the moment I'm recording this. Maybe when it goes out, it will have done. I had a third interaction with William Lane Craig. I went on his podcast, and this was very different again. So I've had 3 interactions with Craig now. I think I'm gonna maybe do a sort of a playlist, and each one of them is very different. So the first one we had on Justin Briley's channel was a sort of spirited debate. Well, I don't think it was nasty, but it was very spirited. Then we had the toad venom extravaganza at the Royal Institution. Check that out. And then the final one was just a very nice, calm, respectful interaction, exploring lots of different issues. I'm really happy with how that went. You know, we're living in these terrible polarized times on religion and politics. And so obviously Craig and I have very, very different understandings of Christianity. So it was great that we could, reflect on our differences in a friendly, respectful way. So let me know what that thinks when it's out. Academic work, I guess I've been carrying on with a lot of the projects I spoke about last time. It's got so many writing deadlines coming in. I've committed to too much as always, and I'm trying to desperately get things finished and desperately get extensions. One thing that's connecting both my public writing and my public writing, bit of a tautology there. Some will say much of my philosophy is rooted in tautology. My public work and my academic work is conscious AI, something I've been engaged with a lot recently. Actually, so I had a whole week where I spent pretty much the entire week with a deep dive into the scholarship on animal sacrifices in Leviticus. I think my wife's threatening to leave me if I say one more word about slitting the throats of goats. And then I had a week on conscious AI and reading everything that's written on that. It's sort of, it's very hard to kind of, you're really into one and then you got to kind of pull your mind onto the other and get in the flow there. And I live a strange life, but I'm very lucky that I can, at least at the moment when I'm on research leave with the Beliefless Spirituality grant, check that out, the Beliefless Spirituality Project based at Sheffield. But how lucky am I that I can spend all my time engaging these intellectual passions. But anyway, it's a bit of a mind fuck. But yeah, consciousness AI, and again, the thing that I'm come back to most in all of these things, and the thing I'm most passionate about, is just we bloody need the philosophy. This is an inherently philosophical issue. Come back to consciousness AI, not animal sacrifices in ancient Israel. And I think, depending on your view of the philosophy of consciousness, the question of is AI conscious looks very different. How you go about answering that question is going to look very different. I mean, if you're an illusionist like Keith Frankish, the question isn't kind of really well defined. Whereas maybe if you're a panpsychist or a naturalistic dualist, I think this opens up other scientific possibilities for answering the question. So there is a real question, and it opens up other empirical routes to solving it. This is what I'm exploring in my academic work in collaboration with Jonathan Emery. Spoke a bit about that last time. I'm going to be talking about that probably more. He's just got me the first draft of that. So look, I just think we really need as a society, most people don't know what the hell philosophy is. I mean, the geeks who are going to be listening to this, that's not the case, but most people just, what's philosophy? Don't we just do experiments? I have faith, as it were, that we're going to get back to the point where as a society, we understand the importance of philosophy and it has a sort of role to play in the public imagination. And I thought maybe consciousness would be the thing to do it, but with consciousness, a lot of people, they just get it. But a lot of people still, probably most people, it's still quite an abstract issue. They think, isn't it just brain science? But maybe conscious AI, maybe this, it's kind of weird. These kind of geeky issues that I've been interested in, absorbed in, people in my academic fringe for the last 20 years, and then suddenly everybody is interested in this question. But maybe this is going to be the thing to get people, to get the public, to get scientists to see the importance of philosophy. I'm oversimplifying. Lots of scientists, lots of the public do see the importance of philosophy, but I just think we're still too scientistic in general. Anyway, so going to be much more on conscious AI. Okay, I think that's about it for me. Really excited with how the channel's developing. This month had a discussion on philosophy of mathematics with Mary Leng, and a short solo video. We haven't really quite done that before. A kind of short, very short solo video on illusionism, what illusionism about consciousness is, what I think about it. Check those out if you haven't. And I'm kind of partly using the Substack as a way of sort of doing a little bit of a deeper dive or some personal reflections on what's on the YouTube channel, but also doing other stuff with it as well. Just try and get something out on both each week. So it's hard to do when I've got so many commitments. If you can support financially or just subscribe, that means a lot, helps a lot. Thank you very much for all your support. All right, let's get to subscriber questions. Oh yeah, I've decided to rename this. I was calling it the last 2 months Diary of a Philosopher. I thought that sounded kind of cool and sexy and intriguing. But now I just think it sounds a little bit pretentious. So I'm going to go back to Ask Me Anything. Say what it is. And then if people want to hear me answering questions for an hour, they can click. And if they don't, they can go and do something else. Maybe have a chocolate bar. I do that sometimes. Vegan chocolate. Not always. I'm trying to be largely vegan. Anyway, let's not ramble. Right. Okay, as usual, paid subscribers get priority. I think there were 8 paid subscriber questions this month, so I just do 10 questions overall. So I've chosen 2 of the non-paid subscriber questions. Sorry, I can't include everyone. It's difficult to fit all this in as it is, but I do my best. Okay, question 1. Clashman, hi Clashman. Enjoy your comments and questions and interactions. What are your views on the metaphysics of time, and do you think panpsychism is incompatible with any of the prominent positions? Philosophy of time. I am inclined to be a presentist. I mean, I'm somewhat agnostic on this. It's a very tricky question, but so presentism, if you don't know about this, is the view that only the present moment is real. The future is yet to be, the past has ceased to be, only the present moment is real. I have an argument for presentism in my academic book, actually, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, basically pointing out that, I mean, I guess what I think of as the major alternative is four-dimensionalism, where all moments of time exist equally, and I am a sort of space-time worm stretched out over, let's hope, 70 or 80 years of time. And then what you're looking at now is a temporal part of that space-time worm. And just pointing out that on that view, the thing that has my conscious experiences right now, the I, in that sense of the thing that has my conscious experiences, won't exist in a couple of seconds' time. Right? Because it's the temporal parts that have the conscious experiences, right? So there's one temporal part of me in the year 1982, a little Philip temporal part. There's hopefully one temporal part of me in the year 2060. Will I live that long? Old Philip. Anyway, but they're the things that have the conscious experiences, right? If you're thinking of Philip Goff as the space-time worm, does that maybe it has some weird conscious experience, but it doesn't have the conscious experience I think of as mine. The thing that has the conscious experience I think of as mine, my pleasure, my pain, is like the temporal part, and that just exists at one time. So, like in a couple of seconds, that won't exist. So, in the sense that I think of myself, I as the thing that has my consciousness, that ain't going to exist in a couple of seconds. So I'm basically kind of dying every second. Now, I know a lot of, Buddhist inclined people or people with cooler, sexier views than mine are going to say, "Oh man, the self isn't real anyway." I don't know. I guess I'm a bit old-fashioned in a lot of my metaphysics, and as I've said a number of points, when I had this recent psychedelic experience, it didn't feel to me it was revealing that the self is an illusion. It felt to me like the self was being annihilated. Anyway, lots of discussions there. It's just it's one important point to have in the mix. What I've just said, obviously, it's not completely decisive, especially if you're not convinced of the reality of the self. Anyway, in terms of the connection to panpsychism, I'm not sure about panpsychism as such, but I think there are huge and underexplored issues of connecting to time if you're a philosopher of consciousness like me who holds the thesis of revelation. Nothing to do with religion. This is the thesis that we grasp the essential nature of our conscious states by being conscious, by having them. Pain is essentially defined as a way of feeling, and you know how it feels when you feel it, so you know what it essentially is. I've got slightly more nuanced ways of putting that avoids committing to some Cartesian claim that we never make mistakes about our consciousness or things like that, or we have cognitive access to all the details. Anyway, I think, if you think we grasp the essential nature of our conscious states, that could have implications for the nature of time. Now, the person I think who's done the best work on this, that I've come across at least, is a former colleague of mine, very good philosopher, Barry Dainton, just recently retired, actually. It was a great conference with me and Galen Strawson and Howard Robinson, the idealist, invited. Very honoured that Barry chose me among those other legends. Those other legends, that sort of implies that I'm a legend. I didn't mean to say that. Those other philosophers comma, who are legends. Don't ramble, Goff. Yeah, so anyway, Barry Dainton has really interesting work. So he argues, I think quite powerfully, that two claims. One, that conscious experiences are extended over time. If you think about, I should have had an example to hand, shouldn't I? Of, well, a word, fear. I hate you. Why do I always think of negative stuff? There's my subconscious. There's a sort of a unified experience of hearing a word stretched out, that stretches out over time, right? Your experience isn't just instances. A single unified experience can fill more than an instant. This is what William James called the specious present, or at least it's extended over phenomenal time, which is the term we might use for time as experienced. Might be just an instant of physical time, but in terms of our phenomenal experience of time, a single unified experience stretches over time. And then the second claim, and this is where he thinks it can connect to actually real physical time, our experiences overlap. So if you imagine, I think he gives the example of hearing, I'm going to have to sing now, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. That was terrible. You know, you hear sort of do, re, and then re, mi, and then mi, do, re, mi, mi, fa, and they sort of overlap. So that each one is temporarily extended, each specious present, to use William James' term for this sort of the way experience is extended over time. Each one is extended over time, over just maybe a couple of seconds. Actually, I looked up the scientific consensus. I say I looked up. I think I looked in one of Barry Dainton's papers on how long the specious present is. I can't remember what it is now. Some debate, obviously. But anyway, but they sort of overlap, right? So we've got sort of unified experiences that overlap. So if it was just one extended experience, maybe it could just be at an instant of physical time. But given all these experiences are overlap, Dainton thinks our experience must be filled out over time, extended over time. Now he thinks this is inconsistent with a sort of a presentist view where the present is non-extended, it's instantaneous, because there wouldn't be sort of room for these overlapping extended conscious experiences. Okay, I probably got some little details that wrong, but I hope that some really cool issues here to think of. And I think it'd be a great project to encourage people to do, to think about, if you accept revelation, could this have implications for our theory of time? I've also done work, one of my earliest publications in the journal Analysis, on one of the biggest objections to presentism, which is supposed to be what makes claims about the past true if the past doesn't exist anymore. Check out my analysis paper on that if you're interested. Okay, Kenneth Slenkovich. Philip, what in your view would constitute scientific evidence for panpsychism, if that's even possible? Thanks, Kenneth. I included this because it always comes up, but this came up last month, so I would just say check out the answer I gave there. Hope that's okay. I don't want to repeat if people have heard last month's and this month's. Okay, Joachim, paid subscriber, thanks for your support. Your work seems much more metaphysical than that of Daniel Dennett or Keith Frankish. Do you think this reflects a deeper disagreement about the role of philosophy itself, beyond just disagreements about consciousness? Yeah, look, I do. I think, a lot of the disagreement in philosophy of consciousness, especially when it comes to illusionism, it does come down to, as it were, epistemological fundamentals. What makes a belief rational? Keith Frankish always presses on me, you're just appealing to your intuitions. How do you know your intuitions are right? And my response is, well, look, we don't know anything. We could be in the Matrix. This could all be a dream. All you can do is start with what seems most evident. And my core philosophical beliefs about consciousness, they seem to me more evident than there's a table in front of me, right? So I'm not saying they're certain. I wouldn't go as far as Descartes, but they seem to me much more certain than the reality of the external world. So it seems to me rational for me to be at least as confident as them as I am that there's an external world. Now, Keith might say, well, I'm being too much of a foundationalist, thinking you start with certain nuggets and build up. I mean, I'm not a foundationalist in the sense of thinking you can't come back to the foundations, when you're bringing it all together in a coherent picture, you might get room to doubt some of the foundations. As a foundationalist in the sense that you have to start somewhere. I think this is not an area I've worked on so much, but my understanding is there are not many these days defending a radical coherentist view where there are just no foundations, or no foundational starting points. Because the classic objection to coherentism is, what if you just have a really coherent picture of the world that's just totally fictional, like Lord of the Rings or something? So coherentism says justification comes from how our beliefs cohere with each other, and there's various ways of cashing that out. Probabilistic connections, maybe. So I think, the sensible position is some mixture both of foundationalism, where you need some starting points, and I think, just start with what seems most evident. What else are you going to do? And coherentists bringing it all together. And so, yeah, I think what do they say? Like Keith and Dan, it's like just science. We just go, no, I'm being too oversimplifying the view, but the caricature of it is just we just look from experiments. That is the only thing. But look, I think science is wonderful, but there are other ways of knowing about reality. Our direct access to our own feelings and experiences, mathematical knowledge, which is, I think, based in intuitions, moral knowledge. And the job of philosophy, in my view, is synthesis, is to take all these things we know in different ways and bring them together. So yes, I think you're right, Joachim. Benjamin Andre, paid supporter. Thank you for your support, Benjamin. I always enjoy our interactions. Do you think William James-style pragmatism that takes into account our human reaction to competing theories can play a role in advancing metaphysical discussion? This may still go both ways. For example, a metaphysics with no so someone might think, Benjamin's saying, a metaphysics with no objective values can't be right because I don't want to live in a nihilistic world. Whereas someone else might think, a metaphysics with objective value can't be right because I don't want to live in a world where I am not free to value what I want. So it wouldn't sell everything Benjamin's saying, but he's saying it would add a dimension to the discussion that is usually hidden, and talking about it openly might have a chance to break some of these stalemates. To an extent, I'm open to this. Well, this comes back to the Beliefless Spirituality Project in a way. I mean, different ways of thinking about faith, for example. I wouldn't like pragmatic considerations to play a role in belief or in our level of confidence in what is true. This is called credence, right? Your sort of degree of belief. I think that should be based on evidence, arguments, what seems most evident. I think you have to sort of rely on that, but not pragmatic stuff. But where the evidence and the arguments leave things open, then I think it's rational for pragmatic considerations to kick in. And this connects with what James says in his great paper, The Will to Believe. But I wouldn't think of it as like belief. It depends what we mean by belief. In the literature on non-doxastic views of faith, that is, views of faith where faith is not a form of belief, is not essentially tied to belief, there are different cognitive states like acceptance, Where acceptance is something that plays the role of belief, where you sort of assume it's true in your practical and theoretical reasoning, but you're not confident it's true. So if we think of belief as very confident it's true, not certain, but you'd put it this way, you'd be surprised if it was false. Like, I believe I'm a philosophy professor living in Durham. I'm very confident that's true. I'm not certain. I'm open a little bit to being in the Matrix, but that sounded like I'm open to going there. I'm open to let me in the Matrix. I meant I'm open to the possibility of it being the case that I'm in the Matrix. Analytic philosophy, me and my wife are both analytic philosophers, and picking up on the precise ways of phrasing things being slightly ambiguous or slightly incorrect. And it's funny, our 9-year-old daughter started doing this as well. She's very sharp at noticing ambiguities. She has an answer for everything. One answer she gave recently, I don't think I've said this before. She said, nobody knows everything. And I said, doesn't God know everything? And she said, no. And I said, what doesn't God know? And she said, without a moment's hesitation, the number after Googleplex, because it's an unnamed number. I thought it was pretty cool. I mean, I guess, strictly speaking, you could say Googleplex plus 1. But anyway, it was a pretty cool answer. What were we talking about? Stop rambling, Goff. Yes, so acceptance, where you assume something is the case in your practical and theoretical reasoning, even if you're not confident it's true. So the example is given, for example, of a general is planning the battle, doesn't know where the enemy are, but has to just accept that they are somewhere in order to plan the battle, right? I'm going to assume that the enemy are there and plan on that basis. Some people think of faith as acceptance. So there are various things that are not belief, like hope, acceptance, trust, and I would think where the evidence and the arguments leave things open, these can kick in. And in my own slightly heretical form of Christian faith, I wouldn't say I believe it because I'm not confident enough it's true. I would say I accept it as true. I choose to sort of live it out. Commitment is another one, I suppose. Okay, thank you. Denny Winkleblack, sorry. First, thank you so much for all your work. Discovering your thinking in books has been a gift. In many instances, I read or hear from you conclusions I'd already come to, and of course, many others that stretch me and usually satisfy. My question. Oh, thank you for that, firstly. That's really lovely to hear. That's really makes it worthwhile. My question concerning theodicy: have you considered the contributions made most recently by American process theologian Thomas J. Ord, OORD, concerning an open and relational theology? His thinking that the so-called omnipotence of God has to do with the power of love rather than of strength resonates with me. I'm wondering if it does with you. Amipotence rather than omnipotence, he suggests. Yes, I've had lots of interactions with Tom. Wonderful thinker and person, and a contemporary person who's been found guilty of heresy by trial, not for any of his theoretical convictions, but for being LGBT affirming. He was a member and I think a teaching professor with the Church of the Nazarene, was it? And he was on trial for heresy for that conviction. What's wrong with tolerating a bit of disagreement? So yeah, I've had lots of great interactions with him. Well, I have a paper that I really want to update over the summer. It's a draft is on my website, Christianity and a God of Limited Power, and I do connect with Tom's work in this. So one suggestion he makes about miracles, trying to make sense of miracles, is maybe God can do stuff where there's indeterminacy in the laws of nature. So my response to that is twofold. One, it won't work if we're talking about quantum indeterminacy. And that's, when we're talking about sort of probabilistic indeterminacy in the laws of nature, we're normally thinking of quantum indeterminacy. It won't work there because that would make God too powerful. Because, like, for almost anything, there's some quantum chance it could happen. You know, there's some quantum chance I will just float up into the sky now. So that would make God too powerful. The whole point of the limited God thing, well, one major reason, I think for Tom as well as myself, is to solve the problem of evil. So we don't want God to be too powerful, because then we'll get the problem of evil back. So it's a sort of balancing act. So I don't think quantum indeterminacy could do it, but there could be, if you're a strong emergentist, that is to say, if you think that there are fundamental laws at higher levels of organization, complex levels, slightly unfashionable view, one I've debated with Sean Carroll, is part of my potential way forward on the science of consciousness I'm developing in collaboration with Jonathan Emery. More on that at some point. But anyway, if there were higher level fundamental laws, maybe they could have some indeterminacy, and maybe God can have some power at higher levels. Now, that's just what I'm doing there, to be clear. It's not saying that's my view. I'm saying that's a coherent view. You know, what an interesting one to think about, to bring into the mix. I mean, I guess I came to think of this. I got this paper rejected once from publication for a journal, and one reviewer was saying, "What about miracles?" I suppose I have in my slightly heretical God of limited powers interpretation of Christianity. I've got a way of making sense of it all, that, you know, certain core elements of Christianity and fine-tuning without that business, right? But it means God can't fiddle in general. You're not going to have miracles in the present day. And he was saying, well, Christians believe in that. Well, okay, some do, some don't. Anyways, but that's, you know, one possibility if you were a Christian who wanted to make sense of miracles in the present day, but also solve the problem of evil with a God of limited powers. So again, I was saying that's my view, but it's an interesting way to think about it. Yeah, and more generally, Tom is a really interesting thinker. Okay, Tim Sayrek, I've enjoyed our interactions. Thanks for your question. What is your view of Whitehead's process philosophy? Yeah, sorry, it's a heat wave here at the moment in the UK, and drinking a lot of water. Yeah, so I get asked this a lot, actually. Usually it's in the form of, why don't you talk about Whitehead more? Why all this bloody Bertrand Russell? I feel with Whitehead, you know, a real kindred spirit. You know, it's sort of free-thinking, rigorous, but anti-scientistic, you know, a sort of more holistic conception of philosophy, taking consciousness seriously, without going into sort of unnecessary supernaturalism and so on. Yeah, it's a real kindred spirit. I never feel the need to buy. I never really see the case for all of the details of his view, all the little fiddly details. They're all fascinating. But when there are people into Whitehead, it's like they sort of think it's all or nothing. They have to kind of have it all. And I'm like, what? I mean, I guess I'm very much an analytic philosopher, you know, and I want to know. I want a very clear and precise and rigorous description of the view. And then what is the argument? How does this respond to objections? How does this connect with the science? And I guess I just struggle to find that a lot of the time, that clear argument in Whitehead. I mean, look, you know, I am someone who hopefully has, you know, achieved a certain respect in my field. But, you know, some people more with the public, I guess, or some sort of scientific people think it's a load of hippie shit I'm defending, right? And so it's very important to me that, like, I'm working with rigorous, clear arguments. And so it sounds like I'm being mean to Whitehead now. He's a wonderful, brilliant, important, influential thinker, and a very clear and rigorous thinker. I just don't always see the justification for all the moves. But there are clear connections to, you know, there's fascinating stuff that's influenced me, and connections with my panagentialism, for example, and his views on agency. Yeah, cool stuff overall. Robert Drayman, paid subscriber, thank you very much for your support. Can we accept the reality of consciousness as the existence of an intrinsic nature without claiming that the nature is of a specific kind? Could the feeling of subjectivity or being forness be an intrinsic character rather than a category that intrinsic natures fall into? Really interesting, intriguing question there. I guess as I'm hearing that, the question is, could there be a sort of pure consciousness that doesn't involve any kind of phenomenal character, any kind of what its likeness is, just pure subjectivity? And well, yes, the psychedelic experience I keep talking about, it seemed to be something of that kind. Philosopher to look into on this, Miri al-Bahari, has used the tools of analytic philosophy. I love it when this happens to, rigorously lay out a form of Advaita Vedanta or an interpretation, a philosophy very close to Advaita Vedanta, where there is a sort of pure consciousness, and she's sort of tried to rigorously make clear sense of that idea. I mean, the way I think about, but I think that can be different. So this is where I kind of part company from a lot of my friends and colleagues who are more into Eastern religion, Eastern spirituality. I believe there is a reality like that, but there's also ordinary reality, and ordinary reality, I think, is very different. And I'm really dull and unsexy in my metaphysics and Western, I guess, in a sense. So that's probably not the right way to put it, but in, objects and properties and the self and time flowing and things. Probably most panpsychists are a bit more cool than me. My current postdoc, Greg Horn, has more cool, sexy panpsychist views than me. But so the way I think about ordinary consciousness, I guess is the general property of having a conscious experience, and then there are specific forms of that general property, feeling pain, seeing color. So like, the general property of shape and the specific forms of shape, being square, being round, and so on. Technical jargon for this is determinable determinates. Determinable is the general property, determinates are the specific forms of the general property. Okay, Edward Dodge. Philip, thank you for answering my question last time on Shiva Shakti. Now I would like to ask about collective consciousness. Where does group consciousness fit into your model? And in other philosophers' models, I don't hear much about collective consciousness in these discussions. Most focus on individual consciousness, but we are clearly immersed in cultural, institutional, religious, family, community, political, etc., consciousness in multiple layers. That doesn't seem to contradict. Ed Dodge. Thank you, Ed. Thank you for your support, paid subscriber, and thank you for a cool question. Yeah. So what do we mean by collective consciousness? So look, this comes back to the question I spend most of my time wrestling with, and is coming up again in my public and academic work on AI consciousness. Which things are conscious, right? I don't think this bottle is conscious. I think my brain is parts of my brain at least are conscious. Which things, I think particles and fields are conscious, but which composite objects are conscious? And we are stuck. The science of consciousness has reached a dead end. I mean, there's loads of interesting stuff going on, but in terms of that question, which physical activity is necessary and sufficient for consciousness, we're stuck. And a lot of the work I'm trying to do is in collaboration, and lots of people are trying to do, of course, is to try and what is a way forward here. So it's very uncertain. I'm inclined not to think that societies or groups of people have their own consciousness. Because I suppose I'm more and more, in some sense, non-reductionist. So I think composite conscious entities have their own new causal powers. So this would mean that the group has its own new causal powers, and you would feel yourself pushed and pulled by the psyche of the group. Maybe you think, Ed, we are pushed and pulled. I mean, you have group energies, don't you, at a large public event or something? I mean, I guess the conventional scientific answer would be that sort of psychological feelings mediated through ordinary kinds of causal interactions. My friend Rupert Sheldrake would have a different answer, I think, say there are some kind of non-standard connections between us in the group. But I guess at least don't see any reason to think the group as a whole has its own conscious experience. Which is not to say that there aren't important facts for philosophers and psychologists to study about the dynamics of a group and the nature of community. And obviously, in a spiritual context, I mean, I'm very keen on pressing the mysticism in Orthodox Christianity, right? The letters of Paul have a very kind of mystical idea of the church community as a sort of the body of Christ, as a sort of spiritual unity. So yeah, so I guess I would say two things. This is all very uncertain. Maybe to some extent it's in the realm of faith rather than belief, because it's very uncertain. Which things are or aren't conscious, for example. But important and worth thinking about nonetheless. I would certainly wouldn't just say, oh, that's a load of woo-woo nonsense. Let's leave our biases at the door and just make sure we're dealing with things rigorously, engaging with the science and so on. But it's very uncertain. Okay, Matt, paid subscriber, thank you for your support, Matt. It seems to me that theories of consciousness all assume that consciousness is a property of something, like an undetectable property of matter. What if it isn't a property of anything? Physical laws are not properties of anything, rather laws apply to properties. What if consciousness is also something that applies to matter? This would not make it a law of nature, but it would be similar. This would be a form of panpsychism, I would think, as an example. Sorry, it's the next sentence. As an example, what if before quantum objects collapse, a calculation that involves qualia must be made? Consciousness would be nature's calculation mechanism, so to speak. It would then apply to matter. Has anyone proposed something like this? Cool, interesting idea, Matt. I suppose I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you're getting at. I mean, just on the quantum connection, consciousness collapsing the wave function is one interpretation of what's going on in quantum mechanics. I should say not a popular interpretation. You might think that's because of reasons of bias. Maybe not. It's great that David Chalmers and Kelvin McQueen have recently, I guess it's a couple of years now, worked out a detailed, rigorous account of the view that consciousness is wave function collapse. Again, I mean, it's a theme that's come up a lot today. Let's leave the biases aside, but make sure we're dealing with things rigorously and acknowledging where things are uncertain. So I'm doing that now by saying, consciousness collapsing wave function is just one interpretation of quantum mechanics, but it's an interesting one. I've also recently been exploring, this is one of the collaborations that I've been working on with Kelvin McQueen, who co-wrote quantum stuff with Chalmers, a neglected alternative consciousness-based quantum view where it's sort of the physical world, many worlds is true of the physical world. It keeps branching, but the consciousness just goes down one of the branches, right? So if when the universe splits, my body splits, but my mind just goes down one of the branches. Anyway, it's sort of a physicist, Ewan Squires, in the 1990s had a version of this, and it was sort of, I think it's sort of been forgotten about, and it's interesting to think about and revisit. And lay it out in a rigorous way. See what it looks like. I'm not saying it's true. These things are all very uncertain. But anyway, but the broader question, it sounds like an interesting view. I suppose I'd want to hear more about, what you mean by apply, spelling out what that idea is a little bit more. But yeah, I mean, as also comes down, I guess I'm a bit boring and old-fashioned in my metaphysics sort of objects and properties. There's the subject of experience and the properties it has, sort of as boring as Keir Starmer. Maybe I'll go the same way. Not a very. I'm probably the most unsexy panpsychist in the country, but that's just me. And there are. Look at Ted Sider's book, Writing the Book of the World, is I think a framework for exploring non-standard metaphysical viewpoints where there aren't objects and properties, where there aren't even any entities, perhaps. Shamik Dasgupta, very cool philosopher who's influenced me, is recently, we had a Zoom call about this, working out a sort of Buddhist inspired picture of things where there's no way of carving things up. There's no objective way of carving things up into objects, for example, entities. And again, doing it with the skills of analytic philosophy in a very rigorous way. It's getting boring now, isn't it? That's been the theme of today. Take these so-called woo-woo ideas, but spell it out rigorously. See what it looks like. Acknowledge uncertainty. I mean, in my interactions with William Lane Craig and in the recent London thing, I think he was like, this claim doesn't make sense, this mystical sounding, unstructured experience kind of business. But actually, I think these more esoteric sounding claims can be made rigorous sense of, and it's really exciting to try and do so. So yeah, sounds like a cool view. Spend some time working it out. Oh, my kitty. Let's have a look at my kitty. This is Kiara, most gorgeous cat in the world, but she's desperate to get out, so I'll just let her out. Okay, final question from Semi-Poetic Consciousness SBT. Hope I pronounced that right. Paid subscriber, thank you so much for your support. As is Matt, thank you for your support. Okay, Panpsychism bit of a long one this. Panpsychism treats universal consciousness as the price of explaining why mind is intelligible within nature. But a more natural ground for that intelligibility is to describe reality as a continuous process in which organization continues only through bounded differentiation, with stasis and overshoot as failure modes. At the biological threshold, that continuity becomes internally weighted. Continuation and disruption become non-equivalent for the organism, akin to an activist accounts in which an organism's engagement with its environment is regulated around viable continuation. Consciousness is therefore not an explicable accident added to an otherwise indifferent universe, nor a property that must be scattered across all matter, but a deeper rendering of a process in which organization already carries the conditions for natural directionality, while the process itself unfolds without either external design or cosmic purpose. If that account already makes mind intelligible within nature, what compels the further claim that consciousness itself must be universal? Okay, sounds really cool and really interesting. Very poetic the way you've described this as well, and I'm honestly intrigued. I guess I'm not totally sure what all of these terms mean. Failure modes, that description of an activism, I don't know, doesn't kind of gel with my understanding of an activism. I guess I'd just like to hear, it's just, maybe this is my ignorance of the certain philosophy you're looking at, but more clarity on what exactly you're meaning by these different terms. I mean, my own reason to start with consciousness, I suppose, I think consciousness is kind of the only bit of concrete reality we know exists. We have immediate awareness of it. When you feel pain, you directly, I think, aware of your pain and its essential nature. And I don't think we need anything else. So there's one thing we know exists, and I think we can make sense of everything else with just that one thing we know about for certain. because, so I'm not saying give up on the claims of science and physics and stuff, because I think that wonderful story we get from physics just tells us about what stuff does. And if we have forms of consciousness that are doing the stuff physics is talking about, physics is describing with its wonderful equations, then we've accounted for all the data. So the resulting view is matter is what consciousness does. So it's a wonderful, simple, elegant picture of nature where physics tells us what stuff does, consciousness is what it is. So, yeah, I suppose my starting point is we know consciousness exists and we can get everything we want without believing in anything else. I think Arthur Eddington, put this beautifully. I mean, this is from Bertrand Russell, 1927, The Analysis of Matter, and then Arthur Eddington the following year riffed on this and, made that point I've just made very clearly. So yeah, if you've got an alternative primitive, I suppose I want to know, how do you get consciousness out of it? Why is it preferable? Again, I need to hear those details of, helping me understand what the view is and what's the motivation for it. Okay, there's a blooming heat wave here. I am about to pass out. I've got a big sweat stain on my t-shirt. Fortunately, you can't see it with the camera. Why am I humiliating myself by sharing that private information? Also, it's my younger daughter's 6th birthday tomorrow. So, try and get all my work done so I can finish work a bit early tomorrow when she gets home from school, and we can hang out. But she's been counting down the days. It's been unbearable for her. Her birthday's still not arrived yet. Very excited about it, so I'm looking forward to that. So, as always, this has gone on longer than I intended, but I really enjoy it. I feel a little bit like connecting to community. I wish I could reply to everyone, and just so many commitments. It's so hard to do, but I really do feel a connection with the community, and it's really nice. Thank you all for your support. Subscribe, support me financially if you can, comment, build a community. See you soon.